God is right here, right now.
No matter what your faith,
all phenomena have natural explanations. There is no supernatural.
Or what you believe.
The human longing is for meaning.
How each of us understands the meaning of life comes down to one ultimate question. Does God really exist?
A part of us yearns for a relationship with the source of all love and joy and hope. And another part that raises its fist in defiance.
For more than 30 years, Dr. Armand Nicolai has taught a popular course at Harvard on the question of God. His text, the writings of two of the most profound thinkers of the 20th century, C.S. Lewis and Sigmund Freud.
Arguably, Freud is the most influential spokesman for the secular worldview.
Religion is the universal, obsessional neurosis of humanity.
And Lewis, the most influential spokesman for the spiritual worldview.
I believe in God as I believe the sun has risen, not because I can see it, but because by way of it, I can see everything else.
This is the story of two men with very different ideas of human existence.
Freud and Lewis represent conflicting parts of ourselves. Whatever part we choose will determine our purpose, our identity, and our whole philosophy of life.
Tonight, take an emotional and intellectual journey into the lives of these two giants as they explore happiness and love, morality and evil, suffering and death, in part 2 of The Question of God.
Funding for this program was provided by Lawrence Rockefeller, the John Templeton Foundation, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, the Paul Montrone Foundation, Tom and Gert Phillips, the ServiceMaster Company. Funding is also provided by these funders: this program was also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station by viewers like you. Thank you.
All over the world, people are asking the same questions. What does it mean to be happy? If God exists, then why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? What is the source of our morality? Is death our only destiny? A man who has spent his life exploring these questions is Dr. Armand Nicolai, a Harvard University professor and practicing psychiatrist. His lectures, seminars, and book, The Question of God, draw on the lives of Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis and an atheist, and C.S. Lewis, the most influential voice of faith in our time.
Why Freud and Lewis? Well, few individuals have influenced the moral fabric of contemporary Western civilization more than Sigmund Freud and C.S. Lewis.
God created things which had free will. This means creatures who can go either wrong or right. But a great many things have gone wrong with the world that God made, and God insists on our putting them right again.
Well,
in Dr. Nicolai's seminar, C.S. Lewis, the believer, and Sigmund Freud, the atheist, are brought together in debate.
if they're making a mistake.
It would be an undoubted advantage if we were to leave God out altogether and admit the purely human origins of all the precepts and regulations of civilization.
In childhood, Freud followed the Jewish traditions of his family, while Lewis followed the Protestant tradition of Northern Ireland. But Lewis's faith would be shaken by the early death of his mother, and then destroyed by the horrors he witnessed in the First World War.
The fact that life preys on life, that all beauty and happiness is produced only to be destroyed. This was what stuck in my gullet.
Sigmund Freud, studying medicine in the age of Darwin, found he had no use for God.
Religious doctrines will have to be discarded. In the long run, nothing can withstand reason.
Working with patients in Vienna, Freud developed the technique of psychoanalysis. He came to see belief in God as just another human fantasy.
What Freud saw was that our Father who art in heaven and our Mother who art in heaven were the idealized parents of childhood, the king and queen of fairy tales.
As a young man, C.S. Lewis had achieved much that he wanted. He was writing poetry and teaching at Oxford University. But his once passionate atheism now troubled him.
I became aware that I was holding something at bay. I felt myself being given a free choice. I could open the door or keep it shut. I gave in and admitted that God was God.
Yeah, but I wanted to ask Michael one other thing, because I'm just curious about...
Dr. Nicolai gathered a panel of 7 thoughtful men and women for this series.
What is happiness? We all desire it, but how do you define it? Lewis asserts that the happiness which God designs for his highest creatures is the happiness of being freely and voluntarily united to him. God cannot give us happiness and peace apart from himself. There is no such thing.
If you don't believe in God, then you're screwed. I mean, and that's not right. So that can't be right. I'm happy, and I have no belief in God at all. I have no connection to that. But forces you to look for deeper meanings that aren't just granted to you from on high, but you actually have to put some effort into finding something meaningful.
It does strike me that the more profound thing for me has been how is joy fueled by a faith journey? And for me, it revolves around Jesus and the ability that that gives me to have a place to stand, to have joy in the midst of the craziness, because life is utterly crazy.
Through the series, we will move from their debate into episodes from the lives of Freud and Lewis. The panel will discuss their experiences with love, morality, evil, and suffering.
So one challenge for someone who is agnostic, such as myself, is whether or not you can be as happy as someone who has a religious or spiritual worldview, where they feel that when they die, things will be looked after and everything is going to be taken care of.
I can take a high dose of a potent narcotic and make myself rather happy. But is that happiness in any substantive sense? I would argue that it's not.
But there's a more profound kind of happiness. If you believe that your life has meaning, and for me, meaning means being connected to some sort of a big picture that makes sense. God is right here, right now, all the time.
Let's look at how our worldview influences our life. One basic question is, does it contribute to our happiness?
In the first decade of the 20th century, Viennese society was all gaiety and glitter. This is how they wanted to be seen. But day after day in his practice, Sigmund Freud saw the other side of Vienna, people who were deeply unhappy and who did not know why.
Freud showed that humans are not masters in their own house, that to some degree we are ruled in an unruly way by unconscious forces outside of our awareness.
Psychoanalysis has taught us that our intellect is a feeble thing, a tool of our instincts, and that we are all compelled to behave cleverly or stupidly by the commands of our emotional attitudes.
For him, unconscious life is a dynamic life, is the repository of our experiences, of our wishes, of our needs, which have been repressed, which couldn't be acted upon. And he said there's nothing more important in his work than to say, I open up a new territory of man's existence, namely his unconsciousness. It is important, it is large, it influences everything we do.
What is more natural than that we should persist in looking for happiness along the path on which we first encountered it? Sexual love has given us our most intense experience of an overwhelming sensation of pleasure and has thus furnished us with a pattern for our search for happiness.
In 1905, Freud wrote a series of essays on sexuality. He stated plainly that sex, or the libido, drives our desires and impulses, whether we know it or not, and that this drive is formed early in childhood. Viennese society was scandalized.
He's accused of being a pornographer from day one. The accusation is that he's obsessed with sex. Maybe the problem that Freud has is that he should have chosen another word rather than sexuality. Sex for Freud is what we are as human beings. It is not simply genital sex. It's what underlies all relationships. But what he says is the drives are the ones, the underlying, can we say, amorphous, unshaped drives, are those things which, in a sense, morph into various forms of relationships. As an individual, we relate to other people, to our caregivers when we're infants, to our spouses. At the base of who we are as a human being is, in point of fact, the sexual drive.
We psychoanalysts are unable to see anything forbidden or sinful in sexual satisfaction. But it must be said, to believe that psychoanalysis seeks a cure for neurotic disorders by giving a free rein to sexuality is a serious misunderstanding which can only be excused by ignorance.
But Freud's theories were misunderstood. What most incensed the public was that Freud claimed that sexuality began at birth, not puberty. He was accused of violating the innocence of childhood.
When he spoke about infantile sexuality at the beginning, he spoke about genitality, step by step in our development, as the sexual component. Later on in life, he does not just speak about the body component pleasures and their impact on us, but he spoke about sexuality as an overall component which connects us together with affection and with the capacity to love.
The making conscious of repressed sexual desires in analysis makes it possible to obtain a mastery over them. It can be said that analysis sets the neurotic free from the chains of his sexuality.
When Freud says science wants to achieve that we are free of suffering and that we slowly learn to love thy neighbor, to be social. This is a condition which is difficult for us to achieve. So happiness is not something which is our aim. What he really said very often is, we want to be in a state of comfort, but we don't achieve it, but we want to be.
Although he was called a sexual libertine, in his private life, Freud was a typical straight-laced member of the middle class. He had 6 children with his wife Martha and found true pleasure in family life.
He was a typical pater familias. I think he took great pride and pleasure in his children. He said of his children, they're my pride and my treasure.
We are living rather happily and steadily growing, if modestly. The two boys, Martin and Ernst, are naughty and funny. Our Sophie is now becoming so beautiful.
When he was not seeing patients, Freud taught and developed his theories about people's deepest conflicts and fundamental needs. What he wrote about happiness was a definition of his own happiness.
One gains the most if one can sufficiently heighten the yield of pleasure from sources of psychical and intellectual work, such as the artist's joy in creating, or a scientist in solving problems, or discovering truths.
Freud would say that human beings have always been internally conflicted, and the internal conflict is between insatiable desires and prohibitions that are absolutely necessary for society to continue, and this leaves us in a state of unease, a state of dissatisfaction, and often in a state of wretched pain. And so rather than to look for another mythological intervention, that we need to accept our condition as it is, that we're perpetually conflicted. And then with the help of what he called the talking cure, we can change this wretchedness into ordinary unhappiness.
For Lewis, true happiness could only be found in relationship with God. When he entered into this relationship, it changed his life.
To believe in God and to pray were the beginning of my extroversion. I had been taken out of myself.
Lewis was a bachelor living with Mrs. Moore and her daughter Maureen, the mother and sister of a dead comrade from the First World War. They were family to him. After he embraced faith, Lewis broadened his circle of friends. He was drawn more and more to the writers and scholars at Oxford who shared his faith.
My happiest hours are spent sitting up till the small hours in someone's college rooms talking nonsense. Poetry, theology, metaphysics, over beer, tea, and pipes. There's no sound I like better than adult male laughter.
The group gathered weekly to talk, drink, and read their works. Literary critics Hugo Dyson and Owen Barfield, medievalist J.R.R. Tolkien, writer and editor Charles Williams, Lewis and his brother Warren. They called themselves the Inklings.
The Inklings actually began around 1933, and Tolkien and Lewis were at the core of it, and they invited friends along. In the 1930s, it was a time when modernism was very strong, both as a literary movement and philosophically, sweeping away the old idealism and putting forward the scientific model as the only means to truth. Lewis and his friends passionately resisted this movement, and the Inklings actually functioned as a kind of an oasis to stand against this trend and to give encouragement to each other to develop their writings in a consciously Christian way.
To belong to a group of real friends is to be armed against influences from without. The public opinion within the group may be tiny, but it matters more than the opinion of 10,000 outsiders.
Lewis and Tolkien felt that the kind of stories they liked weren't being written, and that as nobody else was doing it, they should do it themselves. One stage, they tossed a coin to see who would write a time story and who would write a space story.
Tolkien got the time story, which became The Lord of the Rings, and Lewis got the space story, which became the trilogy Out of the Silent Planet.
Lewis began to realize all kinds of theological ideas could be smuggled into people's minds by writing good stories which would inculcate these kind of concepts.
All this time, Lewis had been spinning his wheels. Then came the conversion. What happened was, when he was converted, he really lost all interest in himself. I can't underscore that enough. What a change that was in that man. He just lost his interest in himself. Not in the things that he was interested in, not in poetry. He was technically one of the most proficient men for writing you could think of. But he had nothing to say. Then along came an invitation to preach in St. Mary the Virgin, which is one of the oddest things that they would ask him, but they knew he was interested in theology. Anyway, he preached this remarkable sermon.
He became this great defender of the faith. He said, I realized that the one real service I could provide my fellow Christians was to explain and defend the faith to them, because he had this extraordinary rhetorical gift. So he became, as his friend saw, very selfless and looked outside of himself.
There was a lot of resistance from his colleagues in Oxford. They felt that whereas a Don might write detective stories, it was another matter when it came to writing popular theology. They had the feeling that it should be the specialist theologians that wrote on theology. Lewis was a very intellectual person, a brilliant mind, but at the heartbeat of all his work is a preoccupation with the whole idea of human love. He wrote a book called The Four Loves, which is about the four kinds of love that we experience.
Affection for family and friends, sexual love, these Lewis defined much as Freud would have. Then he added a fourth category, love of God.
Divine gift love in a man enables him to love what is not naturally lovable. Lepers, criminals, enemies, morons.
Lewis is differentiating between different experiences of love that all human beings have, and identifying that it is natural to love one's brother, one's family members, enter into relationships with friends, male and female, to enter into erotic and romantic love. But he also recognized this mysterious realm of love that did not have a direct and immediate personal benefit. And he identified that as agape, or a selfless love, a love that was truly committed to the well-being of the other, and passionately so.
What agape means in the New Testament is the love of God, the love that God has to us. And that love, mediated and explained by Christ, is absolutely egalitarian. Agape, or charity, is a scandal to reason, because it means loving people not just in terms of justice or what they deserve, but simply loving them, absolutely.
For Freud, what we're talking about as love, he would designate as eros, but eros, as desire, sought an object. In other words, it was a quantum of energy that goes in search of satisfaction with an other. That's a far cry from what Lewis understood to be the human manifestations of agape, because in that definition of love, there is a degree of selflessness. In other words, eros has an aim, it has a target, it has an object, it has an ulterior motive. Agape doesn't.
And the love that's being talked about in Love Your Neighbor exhortation is not necessarily the love that comes easy, the love that is full of emotion, of good feeling. It is a love that extends to all of other human beings, because we are of the same species. We are all creatures who are children of God.
In Freud's attack on the spiritual worldview, one of his main complaints is with the basic precept of loving your neighbor as yourself. Nothing runs so counter to the original nature of people. But Lewis is saying, regardless of how we feel toward the person, we can use our will that we have control over to want the best for that person and act accordingly.
Love your neighbor does not mean feel fond of him or find him attractive. Love, in the Christian sense, does not mean an emotion. It is that state of the will which we have naturally about ourselves and must learn to have about other people.
The commandment, love thy neighbor, is the strongest defense against human aggressiveness. Yet nothing runs so strongly counter to the original nature of man.
I admit that this means loving people who have nothing lovable about them. But then, has oneself anything lovable about it? You love it simply because it is yourself.
Civilization pays no attention to all this. It merely admonishes us that the harder it is to love your neighbor, the more meritorious it is to do so.
What's your reaction to these two diametrically opposed opinions?
Well, I agree with Freud. It's moral and good to start off cooperating and be altruistic, but if the other person defects and keeps cheating and lying or whatever, you're just an idiot if you keep cooperating. There's nothing moral about that. You're a fool. The Jesus ethic sounds better, and it's a good way to start, but what people actually do is they start off cooperating, and if the other person defects, then they do a tit-for-tat thing, which is the wisest strategy in the long run.
But that's not love. Cooperation's not love. I mean, I absolutely agree with you that you know, if somebody's kicking me in the shins, I'm going to stop him. You know, if somebody's robbing me, I'm going to call the police. That doesn't mean I can't love that person. It's loving the person, the whole person. I can at least empathize. I mean, I think we're talking about empathy here. I can see it. I can still call the police on this guy. But I don't put all the evil on him. I don't say, you're attacking me, so you're bad and I'm good.
I think what Freud means is actually expressing genuine love and affection for somebody that's a stranger that's kicking you in the shins.
Yeah, but I don't think that's what the precept is. I think Freud's misunderstanding the precept.
I think in my own life, if I can manage to love my neighbor as myself, meaning to give the benefit of the doubt, even just to give the benefit of the doubt to the stranger, so that even in the simplest kind of interaction, if someone bumps into me in the subway or someone, rather than snarling or having an irritable response, and it's an act of the will. On the days that I manage to do it more than less, each time you have to decide to give the benefit of the doubt.
At the beginning, but what if they do it again and again?
Well, I agree with Winifred. There's a certain, not even going to Christianity, there's a certain pragmatism, I think, about loving your neighbor that actually you see in Martin Luther King, in that if you are able to love those, even those that oppress you, and you can remain conscious that we are all part of a community, that's how we go forward.
That's a strategy.
It's a strategy, but well, it's a feeling. I mean, it doesn't become real unless it's It's a strategy and a feeling. So, yeah, but it ultimately, you know, that gets you much further than a sort of an oppositional stance that okay, we're at war.
What's the point you're making when you say it's a feeling?
Well, if you go through the behavior and you don't feel it, but maybe you will feel it, is that why you do it?
It's irrelevant.
No.
The feeling's irrelevant.
Well, it is will. I mean, you bring yourself there, you know?
Let me change this a little bit. I think the reason you do this, it changes the whole power equation. It's the way you change everything. Gandhi used those kind of principles. Martin Luther King used the principles of loving your enemy, and it changes everything. For example, in Roman law during the first century time, Roman citizens could call upon Jews to carry their luggage 1 mile. And it was required by law. The Jews hated it. After 1 mile, they would drop the baggage and go on. So Jesus says, we can change this power equation. He said, go the 2nd mile. Now, the question is, what are they talking about the 2nd mile?
Is that why you carried my bag?
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. Yeah, you're a Jew. Okay. Thank you. We got it all confused there. But But the idea was the second mile, who's in charge now? And I think the power now has shifted to the one that was powerless.
I find this a bit confusing because I don't know what's at stake in this discussion as between the spiritual worldview and the secular worldview. What relevance is this to the spiritual secular debate?
I would say the difference it makes, we need a worldview. I need a worldview that embraces the complex kind of ways I need to relate to life. I am going to face people that harm me, that are my enemies. How do I deal with that? When somebody screws you in business, you have a choice. You know, kill the guy, you know, get bitter, all that stuff. Or you can choose to say, be smart, but also forgive the person.
But can't you do that without God?
Well, maybe you can. I'm having a hard enough time doing it with God. So maybe some miraculous person, but I think it's so contrary to human nature that when you harm me or harm my child or my wife, for me, you know, of course you can roll over and be a doormat, but if you are a person that has fire, to say I'm going to forgive that person and see them for what they could be and pray them into it, believe into it, treat them as they could become. And I think part of this idea of loving your enemy is saying there's a better side of you. There's an image of God that's stamped on you, and I want to believe you into that. And I think that's where the spiritual worldview is hugely important.
Well, I think Jeremy has asked a question, though. You know, how is this related to the spiritual worldview? We need to understand that both in the Hebrew Scriptures and in the New Testament, that the most important 2 commandments, not suggestions, but commandments.
Not recommendations.
not recommendations, that's right. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, if a person embraces this worldview, then that becomes the
central organizing principle.
the central organizing principle of their lives. Now, it's difficult. As Michael said, your first reaction is, this is kind of stupid. You know, love your neighbor as yourself. It doesn't make sense. But Lewis tries to shed light on that. And he makes a very clear distinction that this kind of love, that's the Greek word agape, has to do more with the will than feelings. There's something revolutionary about this concept.
Here's where I think this came from. The question, does it come from God or does it come naturally? So at dinner the other night, I'm eating alone in a city where I don't live, and I tip the waiter. Why? I don't have to. I'll never see the person again. There's nobody to impress. I'm alone. Because it makes me feel better.
God's watching.
But he might be, but I'm not worried about that. But why does it make me feel better? So I've been thinking about this. Why would it make me feel better? And the answer is that in our long evolutionary history of living with a small community of other people, it's not enough to just fake being a cooperator and a good person, because it's hard to do and people will find you out. You actually have to be a good person, and you're more likely to believe it yourself if you actually do it. And then you're more likely to do it if you actually believe it yourself. And I think over the long eons of our evolutionary history, we evolved a moral sense, an empathy, a feeling of warmth about doing the right thing, not as a fake thing, but as a real thing.
Freud saw human life drawn between 2 powerful and opposing forces. The life force on the one hand, and on the other, the death instinct. The destroying drive.
Let us look away from the individual to the great war that is ravaging Europe. Think of the excess of brutality, cruelty and mendacity which is now allowed to spread itself over the civilized world.
Freud starts out in 1914, as by the way most people start out in Vienna in 1914, being a great supporter of the war. And by 1919 he is as most people are in Vienna, aware of the horrors of what that communal response to the war really has brought. The death of an entire generation. A generation, by the way, in which his sons are part.
2 of my boys are still in artillery training. Martin is already in the trenches. Oliver left yesterday. I discharged a Russian patient as cured. 2 weeks later, he became my enemy who might, for all I know, shoot at one of my sons.
After the First World War, there's a very interesting kind of shift, which is that Freud, who in a sense had been always interested in the growth potential of human beings, suddenly becomes aware that there's a dark side to human beings. He writes a series of papers on what he calls the death drive, about the fact that we, in a sense, not only want to preserve our lives, but that we are always moving toward death. And suddenly he starts to understand evil not only as part of individual development, but also part of society.
These are indeed terrible times. It seems to us as though never before has an event destroyed so many precious possessions of our common humanity. Confused so many of the clearest intellects, debased the highest so thoroughly. This war has let the primeval man within us into the light.
The savagery of war propelled him to a deeper study of man's nature. In the years following the First World War, he brought together all his intellectual interests: psychiatry, history, mythology, religion, into one long essay: Civilization and its Discontents.
Civilization was based upon the fact that people were capable of regulating their instincts, regulating their most primitive, antisocial, anti-familiar instincts. One could be jealous of a brother, one could want to have incest with a sister, but it was important that a regulated human being never act out such impulses. In fact, Freud at one point said, the person who first hurled a word, an insult, so to speak, instead of a spear, was the founder of civilization.
Civilization is perpetually threatened with disintegration. Instinctual passions are stronger than reason. Civilization has to use its utmost efforts in order to set limits to man's aggressive instincts.
Freud does not assume any sort of external moral world which is transcendental. He sees this as part of internal processes functioning in terms of the way that we set up laws.
In our view, the truth of religion may be altogether disregarded. Its doctrines carry with them the stamp of the times in which they are originated, the ignorant childhood days of this human race.
Originally, religious attitudes, faith in a supreme being, comes from the early parent relationship. The parent who helps the child towards self-regulation, towards self-control, the parent who teaches the child that certain impulses like to scratch, bite, kick, and so forth are not to be expressed and have to be controlled. The child's sense of what is right and wrong, what's acceptable and unacceptable, in Freud's terms, comes from what the parent approves of or disapproves of. But those relationships, for Freud, become internalized. So eventually the voice of conscience is from within. What's evil within us then is not the devil. The devil are the primitive passions and impulses within ourselves which threaten us from within, not from without. And when we say, "Get thee behind me, Satan," what is really meant in following Freud's thought is, I will not allow these passions to rule me. I will be master of my own passions.
It is always possible to bind together a considerable number of people in love, so long as there are other people left over to receive the manifestations of their aggressiveness. When once the Apostle Paul had posited universal love between men as the foundation of his Christian community, extreme intolerance on the part of Christendom towards those who remained outside it became the inevitable consequence.
Freud saw his destiny to rescue human beings from their self-deceptions, their convictions that they were so great, so full of love, so full of self-knowledge, and to demonstrate to them that they were deceiving themselves, that they were dominated by sexuality, by passions, by anger, by hatred.
But there was another category of human misery not created by people, and against which there was no defense. In the great flu epidemic that followed in the wake of the First World War, Freud lost his daughter Sophie. She was 23 years old and pregnant with her third child.
It was a senseless, brutal act of fate which has robbed us of our Sophie. Tomorrow she will be cremated, our Sunday child. I do not know whether cheerfulness will ever call on us again. My poor wife has been hit too hard. Indeed, a mother is not to be consoled. And as I am now discovering, nor is a father.
3 years later, Sophie's 4-year-old son, Heinrich, also died.
He was an enchanting fellow. And I know that I have hardly ever loved a human being. Certainly never a child as much as him. I find this loss very hard to bear. I don't think I ever experienced such grief. He meant the future to me, and thus has taken the future away with him. As the deepest of unbelievers, I have no one to accuse, and I know there is no place where one can lodge an accusation.
He said that there are other people that can be consoled by religion, but he doesn't have that available to him. And once more, he resorts to the same stance in relation to himself. He's going to hold himself up. He's going to tolerate the pain. He's going to tolerate the suffering without consolation. And that is what he has accepted. Life is hard, and he will take it.
Freud says that it seems not to be the case that there's a power in the universe which watches over the well-being of individuals with parental care and brings all their affairs to a happy ending. Earthquakes, tidal waves, conflagrations make no distinction between the good and what we consider the evil. And when it comes to relationships between people, the good often come away with the short end of the stick. How do you explain that? Freud says the notion that good is rewarded and evil punished by the government of the universe just does not seem to square with reality. But Lewis, in response, points out that the government of the universe is temporarily in enemy hands.
Enemy-occupied territory. That is what the world is. A part of the universe occupied by the rebel. The government of the universe is in enemy hands.
Granted, the devil would be the best way out as an excuse for God. Nobody wants to be reminded how hard it is to reconcile the undeniable existence of evil with God's all-powerfulness or his all-goodness.
This dark power was created by God and was good when he was created and went wrong. God created things that had free will. If a thing is free to be good, it is also free to be bad. And free will is what has made evil possible. Of course, God knew what would happen if his creatures used their freedom the wrong way. Apparently, he thought it worth the risk.
God allows horrors. How do you reconcile all that we experience and come to expect in the world with your assumption of a moral world order?
Do any of these arguments make sense today? And have they in any way influenced your own personal worldview?
How can you believe in a Christian God when there are things in this world like little girls getting abducted, sexually tortured repeatedly, and then hacked up into pieces? That just happened in Toronto, where I come from. I mean, this is unspeakably evil and awful.
Here's where the theological
how could a good God let that happen?
He couldn't. The Old Testament documents seem to argue that the world isn't what it was intended to be. So I would say those things are because God's given free will. This world is on its own trajectory, but this is not plan A, I'd say. This is plan B, which is a broken world that free reign of evil is everywhere. And I'd say the only thing I see, unless you have a worldview that says evil is a reality, and we have a theology and a philosophy and a worldview that says I can put against evil good.
But there are some who don't believe and who have a conception of right and wrong that's based in human experience.
But they've stolen it out of the Judeo-Christian cookie jar.
Have they stolen it, or have they merely, do they merely coincide in terms of where they end up? What's to say that the Judeo-Christian view hasn't stolen it from human experience?
I think if you look at the spiritual worldview, it says that evil is not a part of who we are. It was extrinsic. I mean, there was harmony and unity, and something, as Lewis put out, went wrong here.
I wouldn't say that the spiritual worldview is that there is these two forces in the world. It's sort of Manichaeism. You know, I mean, I don't think we need to go to, you know, all good God, all horrible devil. I think I can conceive, I can begin to get my mind around and my heart around a God who has a shadow, the way we do. A God, because there's light, there will be dark, that there is a sense that this is, that this is all part of the entity. I don't believe that we're living in plan B. I think this is plan. This is the plan.
That God planned the evil?
No. I don't picture a God sitting there with like a calculus and figuring all this out and saying, and if I do this, this will happen. If I do that, that'll happen. I don't relate to that God. I relate to a force that has set this in motion and that enjoys the free will, not in a sadistic way, but in the way that I believe we're made in God's image, which is to be in relationship. If we can't be in if there's no evil, if there's no bad, if there's no sad, there can be no love, there can be no good.
I think I'm following what you're saying, but in confronting those, not to say that we want evil, that we want bad, but in confronting those forces, that actually, I think, helps us to rise to another level. I mean, it's so without struggle, you know, where would we be? So, I mean, and not to say, and struggle is not pleasant, but it actually allows us to, I think, go to another state rather than sort of...
But this free will argument is really flawed in a number of ways.
I agree.
First of all, free will addressed only the third of the list of three things that Freud listed as being sources of pain, namely the things that people do to other people. It says nothing at all about the decay of our bodies, and people suffer horrible diseases, terrible pain. That has nothing to do with free will. Natural disasters, earthquakes.
Yeah. Well, what is the explanation for those of you that embrace the spiritual worldview?
If we are in fact living in enemy territory, then our life is lived in reality, knowing there's evil in the world, and we've got these skirmishes all along the way. We're having fights where we have one victory. Nelson Mandela is released. this good thing happens, but there is evil. There's no question who's in charge of this world order. That is the spiritual worldview as Lewis has articulated. And it seems to me that if you don't get that, if I don't understand that the world is terribly different than God's plan A, then you're kind of surprised all the time by evil. I think Lewis is saying, don't be surprised by evil.
No, he's not surprised by evil. Nobody's surprised by evil. I mean, I think the point is...
No, if you just say everything's God and everything's good, right. I think the worldview that says there's real evil everywhere, and our job in life is to fight against that.
Yeah. No, but that's not talking about.
A big piece of this for the religious person, though, is that which is something that it's a complete departure where you're never going to be able to have a dialogue with someone with a materialistic worldview about this. The person of faith, of any of the faiths I can think of, whether it's Buddhism or Christianity or Judaism, or the person of faith says, despite all this terrible stuff, I am putting my trust in the fact that it's still part of what will turn out to be a good picture.
Lewis did not accept Freud's view that morality evolved from the harsh lessons of human experience. To him, morality came from God. It was a message he brought to a mass audience in the years of the Second World War. Even as soldiers fought overseas, German planes attacked the cities and shipyards of Britain.
That's the sound that became part of the life of every man, woman, and child.
Military and civilians alike were constantly in danger. The simple security of everyday life was gone. Parents feared for the safety of their children, and the government organized massive evacuations of the youngest, the most vulnerable, to the countryside. Four of these evacuees were sent to Lewis's home in Oxfordshire.
This had enormous impact on Lewis. He'd been living with Mrs. Moore, and they'd been joined by his brother. It was a relatively small household, and he was very attracted to these young children, enjoying their zest as they explored the grounds of the kilns and discovered the pond in the distance and found the chickens, and to them it was almost like coming to a farm. This inspired him to start writing a story about four children who came as evacuees to a house in the country.
One of the children had asked Lewis whether there was anything behind the big old wardrobe, and if she could open it. The question sparked his imagination.
Several years later, he was able to pick this story up, and it became The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the first of the Chronicles of Narnia, which of course is about four evacuees who come to the house of an old professor in the countryside.
The Narnia stories, like Lewis's early science fiction, were allegories of the Christian faith. They told the tale of children who visited a magic land where good fought evil for power over the world. On this journey, the children encountered Aslan the lion, who returned to redeem humankind.
He has a mediator between God and human beings in the form of Aslan, who's very approachable and yet also is quite frightening. And it's a beautiful picture of a Christian view of faith.
But outside the oasis of the countryside, the war was still raging. Every night, people who were huddled in shelters or confined to their homes tuned to the radio for news of the battlefront. In the face of the chaos, uncertainty, and cruelty of war, many questioned the existence of a loving God.
People in the cities with the bombs falling on them were facing issues of life and death, and people were losing their loved ones in war, and it's a huge issue.
The director of religious programming at the BBC asked C.S. Lewis to give some broadcast talks about faith.
Lewis at first was a bit uncertain. He didn't like traveling to London, and he didn't like the radio, but he felt a sense of duty to oblige, and he prepared the first of his series of talks to do with the moral law.
It started as an experiment, just 5 broadcasts, 15 minutes each. Lewis was told to write as if he were speaking to the average citizen.
The next step is from being mere creatures to being sons of God. We Christians don't call it evolution because we believe it isn't something coming up out of blind nature, but something coming down from the world of light and power and knowledge beyond all nature.
It was so successful, the BBC couldn't get enough. They had so many replies begging them to get Lewis back.
The first 5 talks were followed by another 5, and then another.
History isn't just a story of bad people doing bad things. It's quite as much a story of people trying to do good things, but somehow something goes wrong.
These radio broadcasts were collected in the best-selling book, Mere Christianity. The 1940s were Lewis's most prolific years. He wrote The Screwtape Letters, in which a senior devil teaches a young apprentice the tools of the trade, and The Problem of Pain, a treatise on suffering.
Lewis picked up his pen in 1939, and by the time he put it down, when the war was won in 1945, he had given Britain and the United States its major apologetics for Christianity.
If there was a controlling power outside the universe, the only way in which we could expect it to show itself would be inside ourselves, as an influence or a command, trying to get us to behave in a certain way. And that is just what we find in ourselves.
The existence of an indisputable moral law was central to Lewis's beliefs. For him, the fact that we have a conscience points undeniably to a creator.
You might be in a dilemma where you need to rescue somebody who's drowning, and you're risking your own life in the process. But the moral law puts that obligation above your own instinct for self-survival.
There has never been a society in history which thought that courage and justice and charity and honesty were vices, and that lying and cheating and stealing and raping and betraying were virtues.
This rule of right and wrong must somehow be a real thing, not made up by ourselves.
If all of humanity is subject to moral obligation, what's the source of that moral obligation? How could it be something less than humanity? How could it be just our genes or our past history or our influences or our biology? So from the moral law to a moral lawgiver.
Lewis argues that if we were looking for evidence of a God who cares about us as individuals, where could you more likely look than within your own heart at this very central concept of what's right and what's wrong? And there it is. In the one place where you think you might most learn something about God, that's exactly where you find it. And not only does it tell you something about the fact that there is a spiritual nature that is somehow written within our hearts, but it also tells you something about the nature of God himself, which is that he is a good and holy God, that what we have there is a glimpse of what he stands for.